We are about to begin our presentation about assessment in AAC. The ultimate goals of AAC are to assist individuals who require AAC to meet their current communication needs and to prepare them for their future communication needs. During assessment, it's important to gather and analyze information. You need to be considering the adequacy of their current communication. So how are they currently communicating? Do they have a few signs? Do they have some vocalizations? Do they use gazing or reaching, gestures type of things? What are their current and future communication needs? What do they need to be able to communicate that they're not currently able to communicate? What techniques appear to be the most appropriate for them, how to provide instruction for these techniques, and how to evaluate the outcomes. ASHA endorses a participation model for AAC assessment, which is when you consider what the age-appropriate peers are communicating. So if you have an individual using AAC who works for Microsoft and is a computer programmer, then you need to be aware of what kind of vocabulary his coworkers are using and make sure that your client has access to that same vocabulary in their device. If your client is a third grade student, you need to be aware of the communication strategies that are happening in the classroom and the vocabulary being used there, and make sure that your client also has access to that communication. So basically, this participation model just looks at what does the individual need in order to be able to participate like same age peers. There are 4 phases of an AAC assessment when considering the participation model. The first one is the referral for assessment. Referrals can come from anybody. It can come from another SLP, it can come from parents, it can come from teachers or OTs or doctors. Basically, anybody who knows an individual with a communication impairment can refer them for an AAC assessment. There are various different referral forms that can be used. You can go to the SWAC website, which is www.swaac.org. And there are, under the assessment tab, there are a whole bunch of different referral forms that you can check out there. Phase 2 is the initial assessment for today. So you want to be considering what does the person need to be able to communicate and meet their needs today. Think about the different environments that they're in across their day. Do they go to school? Do they go to karate? Do they go to baseball practice? Do they have a job? Do they go bowling? Think about all of the different environments that they are in. Think about AAC facilitators. Who's going to be helping these people to communicate? Is it going to be a caregiver or a nurse or a paraprofessional or a parent? What does that AAC facilitator need to know in order to help this person be successful with their device? And then you need to think about the ongoing changes that frequently happen. What if there's a fire drill at school? What if the person misses the bus? Things like that. What kind of vocabulary do they need to be successful for today? Phase 3 looks at what kind of AAC and vocabulary and whatnot do they need to be successful for tomorrow. What kind of hobbies do they have? What kind of jobs might they have? What curricular units are coming up at school? Things like that. And stage 4 is the follow-up assessment. Follow-up is crucial with AAC. You always need to be checking in with your clients, even if therapy has ended, making sure that the technology, high-tech, mid-tech, or low-tech, whatever you're using, is working and up-to-date, and all of that. Follow-up is so important. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to need to identify the participation patterns and needs. A good way to do this would be to conduct a participation inventory. So this is when, for example, if you had a 3rd grade student, you would go into the 3rd grade student's classroom, whether it be a gen ed room or a special education room, whichever one they spend most of their time in, and you would just sit and observe. Just look around and see what all of the other students in the class are doing. What are they doing and communicating independently? What are they communicating independent with setup, which would be if a teacher gives them instructions for an assignment, that would be considered the setup. So then what are they communicating? Do the other students need any verbal or physical assistance to get their needs and wants and and display their knowledge and whatnot. Think also about the students that are not participating. You need to be realistic when you're looking at the participation of the peers. You don't have to hold your student to be the one who talks the most or the one who shares the most during class. Take an average of what the other students in the classroom are doing and make sure that your client is able to do those things as well. You want to assess the participation effectiveness for your individuals. So how are they going to be the most effective? What can you do to help them get to there? And then you need to also look at the participation barriers. So the barriers that come up quite often are listed on this page. Policy barriers are when there's an actual policy in place that does not allow an individual the opportunity to use AAC. For example, Medicare and Medicaid will not fund a high-tech AAC device for any individual in a skilled nursing facility or in hospice. Typically, those individuals are kind of at the end of their life, and although they absolutely have every right to communicate, even more so sometimes in those situations, Medicare and Medicaid will not fund devices at that time. So that's a policy barrier. There's no way around that. You just need to find a different way to provide AAC for that individual. There are practice barriers. So the example I put for this one was when school districts own the communication device, so the student is only able to use it at school. It's not sent home with them. This is a pretty common practice because school districts don't have a lot of money to be buying a lot of replacement devices, and so when devices get sent home and get lost or broken or dropped in the toilet, then who's responsible to pay for it? So that's a common practice, but it is a barrier for the AAC user at home. There are knowledge barriers where not every individual knows how to use the device, so not everybody has the person use it. Gen ed teachers are sometimes afraid of communication devices because they're scary and new and different, so then they don't necessarily know how to facilitate and help the child use the AAC device in class. Doctors or nurses may not know how to use it, and so they may not ask an individual to use it. Skill barriers are when a family member or professional has the knowledge but doesn't apply it. So this is common with children and their parents. So if you have a child who's nonverbal that you've developed your own secondary communication pattern with since they were born, you've had to figure out their wants and needs even though they were nonverbal. So you've got your own little love language going on. And so even though your child may have this new AAC device and be able to use it, parents are not always ready to let go of their own little language and habits that they've built. So that's something you need to work with. And also respect that families communicate in their own way, and that's how that is. Attitude barriers are when other people have the knowledge and skills but don't want to use the device. You'll see this in the gen ed classroom sometimes if a child is continuously pushing one button that's annoying the teacher. Sometimes they'll go and push mute, which is definitely not something that you want to encourage, but that's an example of an attitude barrier. Access barriers, you need to look at what the student's current what the individual's current communication is, what their potential is to increase their natural speech. Assess for potential environmental adaptations. Do they need their device to be programmed to turn on and off the lights or to control the TV? Do they need an adapted blender if they're going to be cooking in the kitchen and they have low growth motor skills? Do they need a special kind of grip on a comb so that they can brush their hair more independently? Those are all environmental adaptations. You want to assess their potential to use the AAC systems or devices. A part of that would be the operational requirements profile. So what does the individual need to know how to do just to operate their AAC? Do they need to know how to turn it on and off? They need to know how to adjust the volume. They need to know how to charge it. If you're using a more low-tech device, they need to know where all of their picture symbols are and how to utilize them and whatnot. The constraints profile is just basically looking at which things are going to be difficult and how you can work around those. Now we're on to Chapter 6. So this is where we're going to get into the capability assessment. This is the process of gathering information about what an individual is able to do and how that is going to help them utilize AAC. So you need to take a profile of their capabilities and match it to the operational requirements needed for the various AAC options. Capability assessments need to focus on an individual's strength rather than their impairments. For AAC, you want to take a person's strength and you want to run with it. Because what human nature is to do what is the easiest. And so if you're choosing something that's extremely difficult for an individual to do, they're not likely to use the AAC that you have set up for them. Capability assessments need to include criterion referenced assessments. You need to be looking at specific skills and whether or not the individual has those. Some of those skills include, do they understand picture-object representation? Do they have, are they able to categorize? Things like that. You need to have norm referenced assessments in there. You need to have a basic foundational knowledge of what is the person's receptive language like. If you have a person who has very strong receptive language, you're going to look at that differently than an individual who is at maybe the single word level and understands 10 to 15 words. You need to know what the receptive language is like. So norm referenced assessments are a great way to do that. You also need to include predictive assessments. So this is where you're going to take your knowledge and you're going to predict or guess which AAC methods may work best for the individual. Are they ready for a high-tech device, or do they need to start with something much more basic like choosing between objects or a visual schedule, for example? That's called predictive assessment, when you're guessing where you think, not guessing, but when you're predicting where you think they're going to be and you're going to trial that. Criterion-based assessments, like we discussed a little bit, you're going to take specific skills and you're going to create activities within your assessment to determine whether or not the individual is able to complete those tasks, such as categorizing, object picture representation. Those are the two big ones typically. We discussed predictive assessments. You're going to assess the capabilities, brainstorm what strategies you think may work, and then set up a trial for the systems that you think may work. Norm referenced. Often it's individuals who are receiving an AAC assessment already have a medical diagnosis. They may already be diagnosed with autism or cerebral palsy or whatever. In that case, you're not going to report the actual scores from your norm reference test. You're not going to report a standard score on the self for an individual who has a label or a diagnosis already, because those tests are normed for typically developing people, so it wouldn't be appropriate to report the score. What would be appropriate would be to use specific skills that they did well with. During the self on the core vocabulary subtest, the individual excelled at X, Y, and Z. They struggled with X, Y, and Z. Talk about the specific skills that they were strong at and which ones they struggled with versus using an actual number score during norm referenced assessments if the person already has a diagnosis. These are some of the assessment domains you're going to look at: positioning and seating, motor capabilities, cognitive linguistic capabilities, their literacy skills, that one is very important, and the sensory perceptual skills. I'll let you look through all of the assessment for position and seating. There are definitely things to be aware of, but you should not be working alone for positioning and seating. You should be consulting with an OT, a PT, a vision specialist, other people who are more trained. This is outside of your scope of practice to be determining these things, but they're just things I want you to be aware of. So go ahead and read through those. This is more of that, just things you need to be aware of. But you should be working with an OT and PT for all of these. The cognitive linguistic abilities, you're going to determine how the individual understands the world and how the team can facilitate communication within this understanding. The 6 main aspects are: do they have awareness of their self, their wants, and their needs? Do they know they exist? Communicative intent, do they have any? Some students make a lot of vocalizations, they use a lot of vowel sounds, they make a lot of noise, but are they trying to communicate, or are they just doing that as more of a sensory type thing? What is their world knowledge like? You're not going to want to be talking to a student who's been in the hospital with leukemia their entire life about going to the zoo. They don't have world knowledge of that. What is their memory like? Do they have that symbolic representation that we've been talking about? And what is their metacognition like? Do they understand about their own skills and their own abilities?